I am so excited to be here. Thank you to the 108 staff for everything and for the beautiful install that you did and all of the emails you've answered and everything. It's actually very exciting to be here. I was just saying this to you, but I, a couple of years ago, made a very conscious choice to start calling myself an artist and to start calling the work that I was doing art, even if at that moment it felt very fake in my mind. It was just something I said and started applying to art opportunities, and one of the first ones that I got to do that made me feel very much less of that imposter syndrome was getting to be the featured artist here a couple of years ago and be in the Fiberworks show at the same time, so it's really exciting to be back. Also, you being here reminded me of this story, which is that another funny 108 thing, which is a couple of weeks ago, someone else named Kendall Ross attacked someone at a Panera. Yeah, which is, crazy. There was like a viral video where that Kendall Ross attacked someone at the Panera and then someone hit them on the head with a bread pan. And then this random article got posted saying that the police were looking for textile artist Kendall Ross because they got confused, but they used the photo that you took of me for 108. They took it from the 108 website, and so a lot of fond memories here, and I'm happy to be back. They took the article down. Obviously, I haven't been to Panera in a while. Also, I'm not violent. That's another thing. But so it's really exciting to be back. I was very honored to have the opportunity to do this with Taryn, who I respect so much and whose work I love. So my plan for tonight is to keep it chill and casual, and I'll talk a little bit more in detail about my artist statement that was read, and then talk about the pieces that I made for this show. And then at the end, I'll answer questions, so please have questions. But like they said, my name is Kendall Ross, not the one from Panera, but textile artist. Usually people do know me better as I'd Knit That, which is funny because that is just a name that I came up with. I guess when I was 19 or so, I named my Pinterest boards I'd Knit That, and then when I went to start the Instagram account to start sharing my work, I used that, and now it's really funny that 6-7 years later, that's how people know me, just this kind of offhand thing that I did. I'm curious, how many people here, how many of you knit or crochet? A little bit? Okay, you will, yeah, thank you. I've been at your desk, Then you guys will probably understand that when people first find out that I knit, they usually ask me one of three questions. It's usually it's how long does it take to make something, which there's never a good answer for. And then it's how'd you learn how to knit, and then it's how long have you been knitting, or some combination of those. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I'm sure that's how it is. Someone sees you embroidering and they're like, I gotta ask some basic questions. I gotta know. For me, my grandma taught me to crochet when I was probably 6, and she plopped me down and said, I'm gonna teach you how to make a bookmark now. And I was like, okay, incredible, let's do this. And I don't want you to think I was a child prodigy in any way, because she basically taught me how to do the chain stitch, and then I believed I was a child prodigy, and I said, Grammy, you need to take a seat, because I know what I'm doing already. You don't need to teach me anymore. And from there, I just kind of continued to gravitate toward all of those things. I know you said this in my artist statement, but I grew up in a family where pretty much all of the women were constantly making things, in the way that even when they weren't actively knitting or quilting or crocheting or embroidering, they were talking about what they were going to make next, or they were shopping for more materials. And so growing up, I kind of just thought that that's what women did, that women would get together and gossip and tell stories and make things. And I obviously wanted to be a part of that. All of these women that I loved and looked up to were making these incredible things, and I needed to be a part of that as well. And even though I was initiated into the crochet thing by my grandmother, I eventually decided I needed to learn how to knit, which turned out to be a great career move at age 11, which was huge. And I tried to teach myself on YouTube, which if any of you have tried to do that, it is painful in a way that few things are painful. And if you haven't tried to do that and you want to learn how to knit, please don't. Please come take my workshop with me here in a couple of weeks. But my mom got tired of me yelling at her computer at this woman on YouTube who couldn't hear me. So she took me to a local yarn store in Oklahoma City, and I learned from the owner of that store. And learned how to cast on and knit and bind off all of the basic things, and then continued on throughout my childhood and I guess until today to be completely obsessed with it. And I worked at that yarn store in high school, and they called me Kendra for a long time, so I didn't correct them because, what do you say? Like, my name's not Kendra, like, I guess. But yeah, you know, what do you say? When I was growing up, I think any of you who grew up doing anything like this, you were probably never called artistic, you were probably called crafty. And I think there's not a sense of how to guide the crafty folk in the same way that if there's a kid who's really good at drawing, they're gonna know to push him toward art school or something in the art world. But when you're crafty, it's kind of just assumed that you're gonna be like making baby clothes for in-laws someday, which is great, and I love that, any kind of knitting. But when I was having to figure out what to do with my life, I never once thought about going to art school. I did think about being on Project Runway, but that was just because I watched a lot of Project Runway, but there was never a path with knitting. And so I took the side of the knitting that wasn't the actual creation. It was everything surrounding it. It was the history, it was the women in my life, it was the storytelling, and then went and studied history, studied women's history, and specifically a lot of textiles and knitting and all of that, which has ended up being really, really important in my practice today. I have this element of it that is that almost expression element of processing these emotions and memories and experiences and using text to do that, but also kind of this overarching historical reverence and appreciation of women's history and the history of women in my family that hopefully creates pieces that are very compelling and tell stories and I have a very deep respect for knitting, if that hasn't come across yet. But for this show, rose-colored glasses. Thank you. That was mostly for Taryn, but we initially met when we found out we were going to get to do the show together, and I was so excited because I think she's incredible. And the show name that I think I had initially pitched was Jaded, because I loved the idea of the color element, but also kind of that jaded element of expectations not necessarily matching your reality, especially like me in my mid-20s time. And Taryn had the idea of rose-colored glasses, which I thought was perfect because it was essentially the same concept. Because I think when you look at both of our work on the surface, it is, like, it's cute. Like, I know cute isn't the right word, but it's visually bright. And if you were to not read it or think of it critically, you would think it's almost happy or joyful, but then you take one step or read something and you're like, whoa, nope, not that. And so I loved that name, and I'm excited to talk about the pieces that I made for it. So I think if we want to move over to the vest, I love using text in work. All of the work that I do has text in it. Text is very much central to the work that I create. I do a lot of journaling, a lot of diary. Those are the same thing. I do a lot of talking to myself in the car and then writing it down in my notes app, and it usually ends up coming out in this way. Usually my process when I go to make a piece is I will have the text first. Even when I'm working on a piece, I know what text will be on the next piece and so on, like a running list. That wasn't necessarily the case for this installation. So this is called Hung Up on Something, which quite literally it is hung up on something. It's hard to touch it. You move the don't touch the art sign, so it's free reign now. Also, it's mine, so. Yeah, so I actually knit these kind of in a way that I don't normally work. So I actually made this piece first. There's a little bit of a story behind this first one, which is that I was at a residency this summer in Canada, which was great. I thought it would be colder. I packed all of the wrong outfits and was warm the whole time, but that's not important. Just like part of my thinking for it. But I was doing this residency for artists who work with text. So everyone there was doing some sort of text-based work. It was very cool. And a bunch of these artists had studios all right next to each other. And there was this photographer guy, who came into my studio, and I was making this big vest piece, like hand knitting a 5-foot by 5-foot vest. It was beautiful, probably the most intricate, detailed thing I've ever made. And he kind of peeked at it, and I was like, oh, okay, cool. And I was like, okay, whatever. And then he goes to my yarn Swift, which if you don't know, you've probably seen people winding yarn before, like in sitcoms, like Friends, they'll have their arms out and someone's like winding a ball of yarn around them or something. But a yarn swift just looks like a big umbrella without the cover on it. So I had that up and I had yarn that I had been winding on it, and he looks at it and he goes, that would be such an interesting installation piece. And I was like, the thing I bought on Amazon is more impressive than this vest that I'm knitting, this giant thing. And I thought he was joking at first. He was not. And then I had a big, like, basically garbage on the floor, like scrap yarn that I had cut from weaving in ends. And he also said that that would be a really interesting installation. And I just could not get this interaction out of my mind. And he gave me a lot of other advice about things that I could do to maybe fit in more to the fine art world or the fine art space, which was essentially telling me to be different, or to kind of conform to these big conceptual, you know, someone's sitting in an empty room and that's the art kind of things that I just could not appreciate. And so this whole installation started from me making this piece, which was just me being mad about people kind of not understanding all of the work and the tradition and the skill that goes into making what people call craft, which is craft, and I love craft, but people view as an unskilled or unimportant thing. And then they tell you to do these things that take no technical skill. And I couldn't wrap my head around that. So I made this piece with all of the different colors. I'm going to show the inside if you guys want to see it. If it falls down, I'm so sorry. So you can see this is obviously hand knit, and you can see I carried the yarn over on all of these, which is called Fair Isle. We talked about that earlier. But you can see all of the text that is hand knit onto here, each of the words. And so I made this piece, and I kind of just thought it would be a one-off to air my grievances about another like art bro giving unsolicited advice. And from there, I really just wanted to make more of this style of piece. And so I started thinking about ways that I could do it for this show to create something cool for rose-colored glasses and for this space. And then that's when I just started making more and more of them, and thought of this idea of being hung up on something, literally, and this idea with the text itself of kind of starting from this place of, oh, this boy gave me advice that was rude, and then kind of going deeper into, well, if my work isn't important and I am basically alone and none of these things are right and all of this is crazy, and spiraling into this one place and being so hung up on something that you can't get out of it, and you're just so deep into this intrusive thought almost. And I really liked the idea of taking that feeling of being so hyper-focused and not able to move on from this emotion or this spiral or intrusive thought, almost literally, and recreating the same piece over and over again. And so obviously most of them look the exact same, they all say different things. I wanted, after I made this piece, I liked the different colors because it almost feels ransom note-y in a way to me. There's almost like an intensity to it that feels crazy, especially when you take one step back and think about the time that it takes to knit something like this it's crazy. I mean, I don't want to keep saying crazy because I don't love that word, but it has like some level of intensity to it in a way that I really, really like. And so when I went to make all of these vests, make them basically the same, I liked going even further into that idea and saying this concept of when you have these intrusive thoughts and these feelings that you can't move away from and you start to spiral, that even when you try to make something else, you still come back to those same patterns and you can't turn them around, which is when I made this piece. Obviously, this vest on this sweater looks just like all of these vests, but it's kind of dressed up as something different, so it's on the sweater, so it's not the exact same thing, but to me it almost represented that idea of not being able to move away from these feelings no matter how hard you try. And that's when I made this. You can't see the back of it, but the back of it also has the vest on it, the same way these look from the back. It's just plain white, but from the back, so there's no V-neck. And so I went one step further after that. Sorry to make everyone move again, back to the same spot. And so finally, this is one of the last pieces. This is the second to last piece that I made, which was the vest with the sweater with the vest on it. again, almost that, I can't think of another word besides crazy, so I'm so sorry. I really don't love that word, but it almost has this feeling where you're like, is she okay? And I think that's something really interesting about using the text, and text as kind of the central point of all of the work. For me, the text is so important, but you can't really control people's interpretation of the text or what they read into it, which I think is one of the interesting parts about using it. It's also, if you think about musical artists that you love, who have lyrics that you love, for me, I don't love when an artist over-explains their lyrics and it takes away your interpretation or what you thought they meant. I think that that's kind of how I feel with these, is once they're out into the world, they kind of belong to other people and what they mean. Because I've had people who have responded to my work that I thought was truly the most devastating thing ever, and they'll just say LOL or something, or any realm of how people could respond, I think is interesting, and it's everyone's own individual experience. I actually did a show recently, and they had a guest book outside of the gallery, and I think it was an older woman, but she saw the whole show of a bunch of pieces that I had made, and she was like, "This girl does not like herself very much." And I was like, that's really funny to read. Like, for me, the knitting in the text is so personal in a way that is interesting, because you are almost oversharing in a way that is off-putting, but it feels different because it's in this form, this narrative and diary form. For me, knitting is, in the creating of these pieces that have the text, is this sacred space where you are allowed to be so dramatic, so unnecessarily sad or emotive in a way that I think oftentimes is off-putting to people, because people are uncomfortable with feelings or emotions, and they're seen as weaknesses or unnecessary. And so to take these kind of soft feelings that are seen as weak, and combine them with this craft that people often think is tied to domesticity and weakness in that way, I think is really interesting and almost freeing in a way, to be like, I'm going to be the most emotional person you've ever seen, and I'm going to do it using this thing that you think is ridiculous in knitting. So that's all these pieces hung up on something, except this is the one I made last, which obviously is a little bit different, but I liked that it was different, but not even completely, because it's basically the same thing as all of these, except it's blue and pink instead of the multicolor. So you're still in that realm where you're repeating the same patterns and all of that. So this is obviously not something you can wear, right? I love garments. I don't want to make anything except for garments. A lot of people, when I was at that residency where they told me to show trash instead of my knitting, had said, like, have you ever thought about not making garments? And I said, yeah, but I don't want to. I think for me, garments conceptually are perfect for what I'm doing in a lot of ways. I also love almost the simplicity of a garment, in the sense that it's almost playing into people's expectations in a way that I think is kind of funny. Like, oh, you're a fiber artist who knits. What are you going to make? Sweaters? Yeah, I am. Of course I'm going to make sweaters. So that's kind of almost like a rebellion in my mind of, I'm just going to make garments, and I'm not going to play into these artsy ideas that you have of what's important and valid in that sense. And so I only want to make garments, but recently I've been thinking a lot more about kind of the functional aspect of a garment, and the idea of taking up physical space as a piece. So I've been making a lot more large-scale pieces that still look like garments but may not necessarily be able to be worn, which I think is really interesting, because I think a lot of times as a woman, I've kind of been expected to take up as little space as possible, in the sense of people want you to be very tiny and quiet and small, especially in places like I've grown up in, like in the Bible Belt, which I think is probably an experience that a lot of you have probably had as well. And so I've really been experimenting with making these kinds of pieces that I basically have no function. And I mean, I do love wearable garments as well, in the sense, like, you take these things and you wear them out into the world, and they have these really vulnerable texts on them, and that is so validating to both these feelings and emotions and the practice of knitting. But these are interesting to me as well, in the sense of I think about growing up and the women in my life that had made all of these things, usually were making them for other people, for a function. And I think that's something that at least I feel a lot of the time, is that your value as a woman a lot of the time is in what you can be to other people or what you can provide. Like when people say something about women and they're like, it's like, why would you say that? You know, I have a mother and a sister or whatever. And you have to think like, oh, like why can't you just have inherent human value? So I've been thinking about that and making these pieces that have no purpose except to just be art and to be these things that should be able to be worn but aren't, which also is funny to me. So this piece is called Nuclear, which I initially had the idea for the shape for this piece before I even had the text. So I've given a lot of examples that don't line up with my process normally, so sorry about that. But I had the idea to make this piece of the 4 sweaters put together like this for a while. And I wanted to call it Nuclear just in the sense that I was thinking of a nuclear family. You think of almost the game of life. You have, you know, mom, dad, 2 children kind of thing. And it kind of evolved into this piece that I made almost reflecting on thinking of it in the rose-colored glasses sense, thinking of these expectations that I had for myself as I was growing up throughout my life and how those expectations changed and were different, and how kind of you never, at least in my experience, there's a lot of embarrassment over basically everything and where you're at and the shame you feel over a lot of your situation and things that you thought would happen and didn't. So each of these were kind of representative of different points in my life, whether it was like much younger, going into high school and college and young adulthood, all of these things adding up, thinking that the next spot would kind of fix things once you were at a certain point and kind of heal the shame that you were feeling in different moments, but still being one piece, one experience. And so obviously all of this is hand knit. I wish I could show you the floats on the inside of this one. I don't know how. We'd have to take it off and completely change it all up. This piece obviously is different than the hung up on something pieces. You can see I am very inspired by objects, by these physical things that you can see on here, and playing with the scale of them next to each other, just actual things that you see and putting them into almost these collages on the pieces. The process of figuring out what I'm going to put on a sweater is kind of similar in the sense of figuring out the text and the words. I take a lot of photos. My iPhone storage is constantly mad at me. I get a notification every day that it's almost full. But I do take a lot of photos and think back a lot on memories and things. Also, this is kind of an insider hack. I put a lot of chairs in my work. There's usually a lot of chairs. That's usually because I don't know what else to put there, which I think some people think it has a deeper meaning, and sometimes it does. Sometimes I really do just need to fill space on a sweater. But I am very proud of this piece and the scale of it, and I think it's really representative of kind of where I hope to go with my work now, is these more large-scale sculptural type pieces. Yeah. I don't know, I just feel very excited to be here with Taryn and her work, and I think this all just looks so good. So thank you again, and I am opening it up for more questions. I know this one was shorter than that one, but yeah.
I have one.
Yeah.
Since we're standing at the unwearable, do you ever actually wear your pieces?
Oh no.
You don't?
I almost wore one of them tonight. I have one sweater that I made that I wear that has my dog on it. I find it really difficult to wear the ones like this. I actually have never done it. It feels way too personal to me. The idea that someone would come up and read it, like if I'm in a Target and they're like, what do you mean? Like, I remember thinking it, like, it's cringe to me. It's also, I have this feeling when people read them in front of me. I've been at shows before standing behind people where you see them kind of sounding it out in front of you, and that makes me cringe for some reason, hearing it read out loud. But maybe someday. Maybe I'll keep that sweater. I like that one. I like all of them, obviously, but maybe I'll keep that one. Sometimes I'll get photos sent to me of people wearing them, and it's hard for me to interact with it, even though I understand that they're meant to be worn, and I like conceptually the idea of them being worn and people seeing them in public, but the actual seeing it is sometimes cringe to me. It's a very contradictory feeling, but it probably has some level of imposter syndrome, or, oh my gosh, why are you wearing that thing that I made that I was like, watched 2 seasons of 90 Day Fiancé making, like that's so awkward. But yeah, it's a very complicated feeling. So we're about to get into the Intarsia Fair Isle conversation. So the way that I make the pieces is I use a combination of Fair Isle and Intarsia. Some people probably would be mad that I called it Fair Isle, because that's kind of reserved for almost that Scandinavian look, but stranded color work. Yeah. So, and this is actually, if you do color work, this is kind of the advice that I give people, because I see a lot of issues with people when they're knitting where they should be doing Intarsia, where they, like, say right here, you knit with white, a ball of white, you knit with a ball of pink. You don't want to carry this white over here because it'll gap in the middle. And so a lot of the times, even these small spaces right here, this is Intarsia right here, because otherwise this would gap in the middle.
Right, because
so
your floats can't be too long.
Yeah. So I combine them. So like obviously this is the stranded, this is the Intarsia. So if you are not afraid to add more balls of yarn and weave in more ends, it'll end up looking a lot flatter. People are afraid of weaving an end. People say, how do you keep your yarn from tangling? I don't. It's a mess.
Just let it.
I let it tangle till it gets too bad, and then I cut it and add a new ball. If I know it's going to be, like, say this pink right here, I'll cut a length of pink. Most of the time it's the full ball until it gets too tangled, and then I guess and pull a length out and cut it. It's a lot of me being stubborn. Well, thank you so much for coming. I hope that any of that made sense. That was great. Yeah.